they fired him in front of everyone. Not in a conference room. Not in some HR office with a box of tissues on the corner of the desk. They fired Daniel Pruitt on the floor of Callaway Precision Engineering, in front of 43 people who had worked beside him for years, while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the smell of machine oil hung in the air the way it always did on Monday mornings. It was 7:52 a.m. He was 31 minutes late. Lenora Ashby, the regional operations director who had been with the company for 11 months, walked out of her glass-walled office the moment she saw him come through the side entrance. She didn't wait. She didn't call him aside. She crossed the floor with the kind of deliberate stretch that tells everyone around her to stop. Most of them did. And most of them? "Mr. Pruitt," she said, not Daniel. Mr. Pruitt, the kind of formality people reach for when they want distance to feel like authority. He had grease on his left forearm. He hadn't had time to clean up properly. He was still holding his work bag. "You walked into this facility 31 minutes past your shift start on the morning of the Henderson contract review. I don't know what your reasons are, and at this point, I'm not sure they matter." He opened his mouth. She kept going. "We've had this conversation twice. I've documented both instances. Tardiness is a pattern, and patterns become culture, and I will not allow this floor to absorb that culture." She paused just long enough for it to feel like she was giving him a chance. She wasn't. "Effect today, your employment with Callaway Precision is terminated. Please surrender your badge to Gerald at the front desk." Nobody said anything. The CNC machine in the far corner of the room kept running because nobody had thought to shut it off. That was the only sound. Daniel stood there for 4 seconds. The people who knew him well enough would later say he looked less like a man who had been fired and more like a man who was deciding whether the floor beneath him was actually solid. Then he unclipped his badge from his collar, set it on the nearest work table, not Gerald's desk, just the nearest flat surface, and walked back out the door he had come in through. He didn't say a word. What Lenora Ashby did not know because she had not asked, and because the one person who could have told her had chosen to stay quiet rather than make a scene, was what Daniel Pruitt had been doing for the previous 19 hours. His name was Walter Keene. He was the senior maintenance supervisor at Callaway, had been there since before the company moved into the current building, and he was the only person on the floor that morning who knew the full story. He had watched Lenora deliver the termination. He had watched Daniel leave. He had stood with his coffee going cold in his hand and said nothing. Not because he was a coward, because he was trying to decide whether what he was about to do was the right call. And men like Walter Keene don't move until they're sure. He was sure by 8:15. To understand what Daniel had actually been doing the night before, you have to understand what the Henderson contract meant to Callaway Precision. Henderson Aerospace was a mid-tier defense subcontractor out of Raleigh that had been in preliminary talks with Callaway for the better part of 8 months. The contract, if finalized, would represent the largest single revenue commitment in the company's 30-year history. The review meeting, the one scheduled for that Monday morning, was the last formal evaluation before Henderson's procurement team made their recommendation. The centerpiece of that evaluation was a prototype actuator assembly that Callaway had spent 4 months machining. It was sitting in the clean room on the 2nd floor. It was the reason Daniel had been at the facility until past 2 in the morning. He hadn't been scheduled to be there. He'd been at home making dinner for his daughter Cora when Walter called him at 6:45 the previous evening. Cora was 8. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she was sitting at the kitchen table doing her homework when Daniel's phone rang, and she watched his face change the way it sometimes did when something at the shop went wrong. "What is it?" he said. Not a question. Walter's voice on the other end was flat in the way that meant he was managing something serious. "The actuator. Assembly. 3rd stage thermal coupling. It's reading outside tolerance on the calibration check." Daniel knew immediately what that meant. If the assembly failed calibration during Henderson's review the next morning, there would be no recovery. The contract would go to a competitor in Arizona that had been circling the bid for months. Callaway would take a reputational hit it couldn't easily absorb. How far out of tolerance? Ops, 0.08 over, in a unit rated to plus minus 0.04. He was quiet for a moment. 40 minutes. Daniel, it's your night off. 40 minutes, he said again, and hung up. He made arrangements for Cora as quickly as he could. The woman who usually watched her in emergencies, her name was Dot, she lived 2 streets over, she was retired and reliable. Wasn't answering. He tried his sister. His sister was 3 hours away in Asheville. He tried 2 other names before he landed on a neighbor whose teenage daughter had watched Cora once before and was willing again. He briefed the girl on everything. The nighttime routine. The glass of water Cora always wanted but never finished. The specific stuffed rabbit that had to be on the left side of the pillow or there would be consequences. He kissed Cora on the top of her head, told her he'd be back before she woke up, and drove to Callaway. He got there at 7:40. Walter met him at the side entrance with a printout of the calibration data and a look on his face that said he was glad Daniel had come. The problem, once Daniel had his hands on the assembly, turned out to be more complex than the initial reads suggested. The thermal coupling wasn't just miscalibrated. There was a microfracture in the secondary sleeve, invisible to the eye, visible under the right light at the right angle, and it had been causing a heat transfer asymmetry that threw the calibration readings off in a way that would have been nearly impossible to diagnose without knowing exactly where to look. Daniel knew where to look. He had machined variations of this assembly 17 times over the past 4 months. He knew its tolerances the way a musician knows a song they wrote themselves. He didn't leave until 6:47 the next morning. The assembly passed calibration at 6:32. Walter had clapped him once on the shoulder, said good work in the clipped way that from Walter was practically a standing ovation, and told him to go home and sleep for a week. Daniel had laughed a little, gathered his tools, and driven home through streets that were just beginning to fill with the early morning commute. He got home to find the neighbor's daughter had already left. Cora was awake, sitting on the kitchen floor in her pajamas, eating cereal she had poured for herself and watching something on a tablet. She looked up when he came in. "You look terrible," she said. "Thank you," he said. "Did you fix it?" He looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I fixed it." He showered. He changed. He had been trying to calculate whether there was any version of the morning in which he could get Cora to school and still make his 7:21 shift start when he discovered that the neighbor's daughter, who had been supposed to take Cora to school as part of the arrangement, had apparently misunderstood and believed her role ended when she left the house. He drove Cora to school himself. He watched her walk through the front doors at 7:46. He got to Callaway at 7:52, and Lenora Ashby was waiting for him on the floor. Walter Keene had not submitted his overnight log entry by the time Daniel was fired. He had meant to do it first thing in the morning, had told Daniel as much when they parted ways at the side entrance. The company's internal system had been running slow for 2 days. An IT issue that was being addressed, and Walter had decided to enter the log manually once he got to his desk, rather than fight the system from his tablet in the parking lot. He hadn't made it to his desk yet when the termination happened. He made it to his desk by 8:15. By 8:20 he was standing outside Lenora Ashby's office. He didn't knock the way most people knocked on her door, which was a careful, deferential rap that announced itself apologetically. Walter knocked the way a man knocks when he has something to say and has already decided he's going to say it regardless of whether he's invited. She looked up from her monitor. "Walter." "We have a problem," he said, and came in without waiting for an answer. He set the printout on her desk, calibration logs, time-stamped, entry records from the clean room, the security badge scan showing Daniel's arrival at 7:40 the previous evening, and his departure at 6:47 that morning. The calibration pass certification, signed and time-stamped at 6:32 a.m. He let her read. She read for a while. He stayed through the night, Walter said, when he judged she had seen enough. He came in on his off hours because the actuator assembly had a fault and there was no one else who could have diagnosed and corrected it in time for the Henderson review this morning. He worked from 7:40 p.m. until 6:47 a.m. He got home, got his daughter to school, and came in. He was 31 minutes late. He paused. The assembly passed. Henderson's team is upstairs right now doing their review on a unit that would have failed without what Daniel did last night. Lenora had not moved during this. She was looking at the logs. He didn't say anything, she said, not defensive, genuinely trying to process it. No, Walter said, he didn't. Why not? Walter looked at her for a moment before he answered, because you didn't ask. The Henderson review concluded at 11:40 a.m. The procurement lead, a measured woman named Louise Harker, told the Callaway executive team that the assembly had met all specified parameters and that she expected to have a formal recommendation to her board within the week. The room received this news with the kind of relief that people try to look professional about, and mostly fail. Downstairs, the floor was running normally. The CNC machines were cutting. The quality station was logging measurements. 43 people were doing their jobs. Daniel Pruitt was at home. He had stopped at a gas station on the way and bought a coffee he didn't really want and a granola bar he ate in the car without tasting it. He sat in his driveway for a while after he got home. The street was quiet. The neighbors' recycling bins were still out from Friday. A dog was barking somewhere at the end of the block. He went inside and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Cora had been doing her homework when Walter called the night before. And he didn't do anything for a long time. He wasn't angry, exactly. He was something quieter than anger and harder to name. The kind of feeling that comes when you realize that the place you gave something to didn't know you were giving it. His phone rang at 9:40. He looked at the screen. Callaway Precision, main line. He let it ring. It rang again at 9:53, then at 10:12, then at 10:41. The fourth call he picked up. It was not Lenora Ashby. It was a man named Stuart Oakes, the company's VP of operations, who had been in a site visit at the Henderson review prep and had come back to his office to find Walter Keene waiting outside his door with a folder and an expression that Stuart later described to his wife as the face a man makes when he's already decided he's right and is giving you the courtesy of being told before he acts on it. Stuart had read the folder. Daniel, he said when the call connected. My name is Stuart Oakes. I'm the VP of operations here at Callaway. I don't think we've spoken directly before. No, Daniel said. I want to talk about what happened this morning. I want to do that in person if you're willing. I know that's a significant ask given the circumstances. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Is the Henderson review done? Stuart paused slightly, surprised by the question. It concluded about an hour ago. Did it go well? Another pause. Longer, yes, Stuart said. It went well. Okay, Daniel said. I'll come in. He sat in a conference room on the third floor. Stuart was there. Lenora Ashby was there. Walter was there, which Daniel hadn't expected but felt something loosen in his chest when he saw. There was water on the table and a yellow legal pad that nobody touched. Stuart spoke first. He laid out what they had learned that morning. The overnight log, the calibration records, the full sequence of events as Walter had reconstructed it. He spoke without editorial, which Daniel respected. Just the facts in the order they happened. When Stuart was finished, the room was quiet. Lenora Ashby had been looking at the table for most of Stuart's account. Now she looked at Daniel. I didn't know, she said. I know, he said. That doesn't make what I did acceptable. No, he agreed. It doesn't. She nodded slowly. Whatever she had been preparing to say next, she set it aside. I'd like to ask you something, and I want you to know you don't have to answer it. He waited. Why didn't you say something? When it was happening, you could have told me what you'd done. Daniel looked at her for a moment. He thought about the floor at 7:52 in the morning. The 43 people who had stopped what they were doing. The CNC machine still running in the corner because nobody had thought to shut it off. Because it shouldn't have needed saying, he said. If a person decides to make an example out of you in front of everyone you work with, they've already decided. Explaining yourself in that moment isn't a conversation. It's a defense, and I wasn't going to defend myself for doing my job. Nobody said anything. Can I ask you something, he said, looking at Lenora. She met his eyes. Are you apologizing because I worked through the night, or because you found out? The question sat in the room. Lenora Ashby didn't look away from it. She took her time. I don't know yet, she said. I think that's something I have to be honest with myself about. She paused. But I know what I did was wrong, and I know what you did was extraordinary, and I know those two things don't cancel each other out. It was, Daniel thought, probably the most honest thing he had heard from anyone in a position of authority in a very long time. The reinstatement offer came in writing the following morning, with a formal correction to his employment record and a letter from HR that acknowledged the termination had been made without full information and had been rescinded accordingly. Stuart Oakes called personally to make sure Daniel had received it and to say, without the formality of the letter, that Calloway wanted him back and understood if he needed time to decide. Daniel needed 2 days, not because he was uncertain. He was certain almost immediately, in the way that people who have spent a long time doing one thing well tend to be certain about whether they want to keep doing it. He needed 2 days because Cora had a school event on Tuesday that he had promised to attend, and he had missed enough things he'd promised, and this one he was going to keep. He went back on Wednesday morning. He came in through the side entrance, the same one he always used, at 7:18, 3 minutes early. The floor was already running. Several people looked up when he came in. A few nodded. One of the guys on the quality station, a man named Pete who had worked beside Daniel for 6 years and hadn't said anything during the termination because he hadn't known what to say, walked over and shook his hand without making a production of it. That was enough. Walter was at his desk when Daniel stopped by. "You're early," Walter said, not looking up from his logbook. "Trying something new," Daniel said. Walter made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had been given a little more room. Daniel went to his station. He put on his safety glasses. He picked up the job ticket for the morning's first run, a batch of precision-bearing housings for a medical equipment manufacturer out of Cleveland, and he read it the way he always did, carefully, twice, before he started anything. The floor ran. The machines cut. The shift moved forward the way shifts do, when people who know what they're doing get back to work. 2 weeks later, Callaway Precision received formal notification from Henderson Aerospace that the procurement board had approved the contract recommendation. The value of the agreement was just under $4 million and represented the beginning of what Henderson described in their letter as a long-term supply relationship. Stuart Oakes sent a company-wide email. There was a catered lunch in the break room. People shook hands and talked about what the work pipeline would look like for the next 18 months. Daniel ate lunch at his workbench because he was in the middle of a tolerance check on a component that couldn't wait, and because lunch in the break room with 43 people was not how he preferred to celebrate anything. He found out later, from Walter, that Lenora Ashby had told Stuart she believed the actuator assembly would have failed the Henderson review without Daniel's intervention, and that she had included that assessment in the internal post-contract report as a matter of record. She hadn't announced it. She hadn't made a speech. She had written it down, accurately, where it would be seen by the people who needed to see it. Walter told him this the way Walter told him most things, without decoration. Just the information delivered straight. She didn't have to do that, Daniel said. No, Walter said. She didn't. He picked Cora up from school that afternoon, the same way he picked her up every day he could manage it. Parked on the side street half a block from the entrance, so he could watch her come out through the gate, which she always did at a slight run because she was the kind of kid who approached most things at a slight run. She saw him, stopped running for exactly 2 steps, then started again. She climbed into the passenger seat and dropped her backpack on the floor and said, "Can we get ice cream?" in the tone of someone who has already decided the answer is yes. "Yeah," he said, "we can get ice cream." She buckled her seatbelt. She looked at him with the particular directness that children sometimes have before they learn to be strategic about what they ask. "Are things better at work now?" He thought about the conference room on the 3rd floor, the letter from HR, Pete's handshake on the quality floor, Walter's logbook, open on his desk every morning at 7, recording things the way things deserve to be recorded, carefully and without leaving anything out. "Yeah," he said, "things are better." She seemed to weigh this. Then she looked out the window at the street going by and said, "Good, because you're a really good fixer, and it would be stupid if they didn't know that." He didn't say anything. He just drove. Some things don't need a response. They just need to be heard and held on to and carried forward into whatever comes next.